Good evening. Well, we're back. We've been off for a few weeks. So some of you might have been wondering what's been going on, but we haven't forgot about you. We haven't abandoned you. We just took a couple weeks off to regroup, and we have some good content coming before you tonight, and a couple of the things coming up in the future. We'll talk about that later. But we have a great discussion tonight, um, sort of gearing up towards the Easter holiday weekend coming up this weekend. We're going to discuss something that many of you have never really delved into and have considered to think about around this time of year. In fact, this particular book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree by James Cone, we've discussed Cone's work here before. We had a great discussion when we did that prior to tonight. And I'm pretty sure we're going to have a good discussion on this topic as well. As always, it's not just us talking. We want to get you involved. So those who are listening right now, if you could just can drop in the chat where you're listening from, just kind of want to get an idea where our audience is tuning in from. And then also we want you to interact. We're gonna have some questions coming up later on in the program. We want you to be able to get involved and answer those questions on what's on your mind. We'll get to the comments as we go along. We'll try to get to as many as possible. But we just want to let you know that this is not us presenting to you, but it's more of a group discussion. So I got my comrades on as always. We're short one tonight, but we're still going forward. Amari is going to lead us off and take us through this piece of work that we're going to be discussing tonight, and we'll go from there.
All right, y'all. Peace. How y'all doing tonight?
Oh, peace, bro. Good, real good.
Okay. Yeah. UG?
Yeah, man. Good.
All right. Well, I know we're coming up on Easter, celebration that many Christians celebrate. And so that's one of the reasons why I think that we want to talk about it and expound even more on some of James Cone's work. As we talked before, maybe about a month ago, James Cone was the founder of Black liberation theology. He did write this book called The Cross and the Lynching Tree, and this is what we're going to be discussing a little bit or some of his work from this book. Just to give him a little bit more credit for the work that he did do as a theologian, and just appreciate what he did do. But let's look at it a little bit. So James Combs, like we discussed maybe a couple of weeks ago, the founder of Black liberation theology. He was a professor at the New York Union Theology Seminary before he died in 2018, a couple of years ago. He challenged the dominant white theological paradigm. He wrote many books about Black theological, the Black theological liberation, God and the Oppressed, Malcolm and Martin. What else did he write? And he also wrote this book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, which we'll be talking about tonight. But he wrote a lot of books. But like I said, tonight we're just talking about The Cross and the Lynching Tree. The reason why James Combs came up with the idea of Black theology, like he was a seminary student, very religious, grew up in a religious household, but during the 60s, he was realizing that he was feeling as if the church was not speaking to him directly. He was feeling as if the church was not speaking to the plight of African Americans or Black people at that time directly. There was something missing. And even during that time, there was a time when a lot of people was quote unquote leaving the church because it wasn't directly speaking to them. A lot of Black people at that time was speaking. I guess they've always thought if God was real, why would He allow us to be in this position? And so during the 60s, there was a lot of that going on. If God was real, Jesus Christ was real, why are we here? Right? But then at the same time, onto the scene was Elijah Muhammad. Onto the scene was Malcolm X. And he got a sense of understanding who he personally was through listening to Malcolm. He got a better understanding of what Christ was and what Christ meant to him by listening to the works of Martin Luther King. But somehow he thought, somehow he was thinking, is it possible to have more or less like a combination of two? because he felt, like I said, he felt that the white theology has been involved in the struggles of black. Well, he felt that white theology has never been involved in the liberation of black people. White theology was basically the theology of white oppressors giving religion sanctions to the genocide of enslaved people, whether that be Africans or American Indians. So he was saying this, that he felt like, the God that he was given was not speaking, like I said, was not speaking to him. And then the lies that have been told, like in a racist society, God is never colorblind. But he thought to say that God is colorblind is like saying that God is blind to justice and injustice, to right and wrong, to good and to good and evil, The goals of black theology seeks to interpret the gospel of Jesus Christ in the light of the black condition. To have a better to have a better understanding of Christ, one must identify with the suffering of black people in America, right? So in this, and this how we leads up to the book, the cross and the lynching tree. To have a better understanding of Christ, we must look at the suffering of Christ and the things that he did, and how he made sacrifices, and align those up with the lives and the works of what African Americans have been doing currently.
Okay, so with that said, I guess for our viewers, tell us about these two symbols that are described in the title of the book. Before we get into more detail, tell us about the cross and the significance of that within history, and then also the lynching tree. Tell us what that is and the significance of that in history as well.
But it's just two things, right? For the cross, the Romans, not just the Romans, but during that time, to be crucified was something that the Romans used to punish people. So one is just a punishing tool. Whether it could be a belt to a cross. So people were nailed to the cross as a form of punishment. All right, that's just simply what it was. Same thing as the lynching tree. A lynching tree is just a tree that in which somebody was hung, put upon a noose, head upon a noose, and hung from a tree to die. Okay. But from a Christian standpoint, the cross means a lot more than just the form of punishment. Nowadays, the cross is a symbol of Christ and everything what he means, his foundation of who Christ is, right? The suffering, the ability to be born again, the ability to it's really, for Christians, more or less the foundation of what it is, if there was a symbol. And from a symbol standpoint, for the lynching tree, for African Americans, is that it's a sign of terror, right? To know that that's something that you can, or at some point that maybe someone was hung from or died on. So so I remember one time I went down south, and we were just down south, and it was like, I don't know. I mean, it could, these type of things happen anywhere. I don't know if you guys went anywhere, just went and thought of some things like, what does this mean, or how did this get here? So one time we went down south, and we saw a cotton field. Never seen a cotton field ever before in my life. I've never seen cotton like outside of. I know I have a cotton T-shirt, but I've never seen cotton, right? But we pulled over, and God, it's like, we're in Alabama too. So we pulled over, and it was like, your mind just wanders, right? And so no matter what, even though we're different time, different place, it still was a symbol of, what, there could have been descendants of mine picking cotton here. So So it's the same thing for a tree. Same thing. That tree represents a lot for African Americans too, especially in the South, because they know that maybe that some of their parents or grandparents or whatever had the ability to have died or been hung from one of those trees. You know.
Yeah, and Amari, just for clarity, we're going to display images of men hung from trees later on in the presentation, actual pictures. We're not doing it now because we want to give everybody a heads up first that this is coming, because we understand the trauma involved in watching or looking at a picture like that. And we want to give everyone a heads up that it will be coming later in the presentation, because we believe in acknowledging, exploring our history, especially the painful parts. And so those images will be there. We will be showing images shortly, but right now we are showing a censored image, and a little bit later we will be showing a couple, because we think that it advances the meaning and the purpose of this conversation. So I just wanted to insert that, Amari. And then also something you said before that could be new learning for some of our audience is about the act of crucifixion. Some people may think, because at one time I thought that only Jesus Christ was crucified. However, crucifixion was a normal part of discipline and punishment under the Roman Empire millennia ago. Could you speak to the purpose of crucifixion within the Roman Empire?
Well. This is where he draws his comparison, right? He talks about how the Roman Empire used crucifixion as a way of punishment. So now keep in mind that there's other forms of punishment that the Roman Empire can use, but crucifixion was used for a special form of punishment. So and same thing when black people were hung. I mean, it's for a reason. Let's talk about some of the reasons why and what they look like first. So let's look at one reason why you can find somebody being crucified or hung or whatever was become an enemy of state or an enemy of the current state of life, right? So if we just look at Jesus was at the time saying he was a king of the Jews. He was going against the rule of the Roman Empire, and so anybody going against the rule of the empire, they have to make an example of it can't be happening. So, like I said, it wasn't done for anybody, any or everybody. Any everybody could have been shot. Any or everybody could have not been shot during that time. But any or anybody, everybody could have been disciplined any other way. But somebody was going against the rule of law. They wanted to make a example of. So he was the enemy of the state. So the state hated them, just like slaves or ex-slaves were enemy of white people way of life at that time. Keep in mind, so a lot of slaves, a lot of lynching happened after Reconstruction, after the slaves were free, right? After enslaved Africans were free, and so during that time, a lot of white people felt fearful of, or they didn't want to have the thought of, like a black person taking orders from black people, or even having the thought of having the thought of, excuse me, taking orders or living equally next to with black people. So that's so they were enemy of the way of life or enemy of state. Another thing about that thing, Ike, it was state sponsored. So the Roman Empire at that time, this was their form of government. This was their form of punishment. But even in America, even though they quote unquote the government didn't sanction it, they knew about it and didn't do anything about lynching. So in this form of not totally be state censored, sponsored, more or less, the state knew. American government, states, local governments, they knew, and they did nothing to stop the lynching black people at that time.
So it sounds like crucifixion was a way to protect and maintain power, and it was a punishment reserved for the most substantial.
Yeah. So it's more hideous. So they at that time they talk about the most low lives, the worst of the worst. We get it, and they need to use it like an example. So if you do this will happen, right? And it did it in public so that everybody can see. Because same time you can kill somebody in the dark and come out with the same result, right? You did something wrong. I want you killed. I want to kill you, and let's do it behind closed doors. But it's very important for them to do it out in the public so that everybody can see and use that as a form of terror to control, right? For some of the younger people, they might remember in an episode of The Wire where what was that, stupid Chris, right? Stupid Chris was killing people and putting people in the vacants, and when they somehow hooked up with probably I think the Avon's people, and they needed them to kill some people off the streets of Baltimore, more or less, but they was hiding the bodies. So from one standpoint, you're getting rid of the competition, but they needed people to see that Chris and Snoop was running the streets. And so if you hide the bodies, nobody would see the work that you're doing, right? That same level of terror. Now, same thing here is the Roman Empire wanted people to see if you go against the state, this was going to happen to you. And so keep in mind, so it's a long, painful death. Sometimes it's a lot easier just to kill you when you're done and over with, right? But this was a long, painful death in front of people. So the goal also was to humiliate you and to make you feel less than whatever you were. So in Jesus' time, they would strip you naked and he had to bear your own cross, and it was a spectacle. Everybody came to see what was going on, and they were throwing rocks at you or saying cussing at you, whatever it was, on the road to where you were going to be crucified at. Also, the crucifixion was done like entering into the city. So anybody coming in or exiting the city or wherever the crucifixion was happening, it was also there. They were there as an example. This is what's going to happen to you. So as you enter, keep in mind, you come in here trying to cause some trouble. This is what can happen to you. So they were left to hang as a warning to others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting because people don't tend to realize that Jesus was killed, was crucified along with two others. So he wasn't the only one up there. It was three. It was three at the time. The significance of his particular crucifixion was, and it points out, according to the Bible, is that his was a little different. I don't believe it was custom to make them carry the cross the way he did. He was the only one that had to carry his. The other two just sort of were already up there by the time he got there. But during his bearing of the cross, he had to wear a crown. They gave him a crown of thorns, mocking him. They spit on him. They even took a sword once he was up on the cross and stabbed him in his side. So they did a little extra effort, and the Bible speaks about this, is to show how much they really hated him and how his particular crucifixion was a little out of the ordinary, to show just how much he went through to die for our sins, according to the Bible. So, but you're right though. That is customary of what they did back in that day to show an example. The two people he was crucified with were, I think one was a murderer and one was a robber, I think, or something like that nature. But his crime was only thing he said he was the king of the Jews, and that was enough to get him crucified. So, but let's explore something else here. If you're ready to move on, I'm not sure.
We can.
Okay. And I think you kind of touched on this, and I might move on to the next question. If so, did you kind of talk a little bit more though? Well, I think you kind of did. You talked about the parallel between the cross and the lynching tree, right?
Mm-hmm.
So let's look at when did lynchings occur and how frequently?
So it's two things. So in movies you might see, and he talks about this a little bit too. In movies you might see slaves being hung for various crimes. And he makes a great point in this in the book in some of his speeches. Also, he says that but that didn't happen very often because keep in mind slaves during that time before they were freed, they were property, and so it would have mean more to just to whip them or do whatever form of punishment to get them to more or less be in line. But the last thing we want to do as a last thing you want to do is kill your property that's making making you money. So if it's just like right now, if we're using our car we're using our car to make money, and let's say that maybe for whatever reason we're not liking our car today, maybe we didn't want to start today, but do we blow it up? Do we shoot it because for one day or whatever it didn't do what it's supposed to be doing, even though it still has life in it, right? So you wouldn't give up your property or you wouldn't waste your property in those eras. But once Reconstruction happened, once the end of the Civil War, once the end of the Civil War happened, um, and freed enslaved Africans started to participate in government and political freedoms. You had the founding of the KKK, and they felt that they need to redeem American values, redeem American values, and keep the white man's country, safe. Um, so you had those type of those ideas. And then at the same time, you had the transformation of the image of ex-slaves, enslaved Africans. Beforehand, you had the image of you had the Sambo and the mammy type viewpoint of slaves, right? So they were docile, they were happy to be slaves, they worked real hard on the plantation. They worked real hard on the plantation, and they were happy to be here. But after Reconstruction, the imagery started to change, and it became more or less, the black beasts and Jezebels, right? Um, it even goes like you look at the one of the first films ever made was like The Birth of a Nation. It kind of goes into that whole idea of being afraid of what the black man can do, and they're going to rape black women, or they're going to rob and steal. All those type of imagery start to come about to bring about that terror, the mental terror of what freed enslaved people would do. Right? What a mistake! What a mistake this nation has made by freeing the people that should have stayed slaves. So during that, like I said, so during that time, you had 4,020 years of probably 1865 to 1960. You might consider there was probably 4,000, a little bit over 4,000 people that were lynched. All because of same thing that happened in Rome, as in the way to control, to bring terror, and those things was done for the same reason for Africans.
So if I understand correctly, there was a period of time, during the times of chattel slavery, it was nothing for an enslaved black man or woman to be beaten within an inch of their life, but rarely were those lives taken because the black slave was considered a utility. You compared it to like a car, for example. Mm-hmm. And we have explored previously how there were instances where enslaved black men or women were beaten and killed as a result, and laws were passed to protect white men, white slave owners, from being prosecuted for the death or for the murder of their black slaves. They're called the Casual Killing Act. So in the rare cases when black slaves were killed, were beaten and then died, white whites were not subject to any legal discourse, was not considered murder because black slaves were not considered humans.
Mm-hmm.
But upon the abolishing of slavery, we now see black men and women hung by trees as a means of social control, of terror, of fear and intimidation. Is that right?
Yeah, yes, exactly what was going on. Because you keep like you think about if you look at the states at the time, there are some states where there were more freed enslaved Africans than there were white people.
Mm-hmm.
And so just the thought of that, just the thought of at the same time, so they were beginning to have the freedom to be able to vote, have so run for political office. And for some white people at that time, just the thought of that. Think about 3 or 4 years ago, I was your master. Now you're telling me I gotta take orders from you. So from that standpoint, with the idea of white supremacy, how is this possible? And so during a few some of those years, there was some protection to make sure that blacks were safe during that time. Whatever threats could to come about. But once at the ending of Reconstruction and the protective forces left, the government turned a blind eye to what was going on in the South and how the treatment of African Americans at that time. So this is how the KKK ran rapid. You know what I'm saying? This is how the KKK ran rapid. So when I say it was state terror, this is how many people in the KKK they were part of the police force, right? Or they were part of the police force, or it was easy for African Americans to be tried and held to court or whatever and found guilty all in one day without due process. It just happened automatically. So these things happen. Typically, there should be a process, but because we were caught for whatever reason, all you can find yourself found guilty just because. So you think about situations of for any reason. So that for any reason, just being caught walking down the street, and that was good enough reason. So no, I don't like you. Let's hang them up. Let's hang them up on the tree, and that would just be that would just be what it is.
Let's. I just want to jump in real quick. I want to explore this a little further because I'm still hung up a little bit here. So the parallel between the lynching tree and the crucifixion of Christ. What gives James Cone the note? I don't want to say the audacity, but I kind of do want to say that.
Say it, G. Say it, G.
You know what I'm saying? What? I mean, that's a pretty huge. I mean, I kind of get it, but I want to talk about it a little further. So when you think about the crucifixion of Christ, this is supposed to symbolize something a little further than somebody committing a crime or someone feeling just because you looked at a person wrong. Now, someone could be lynched for these particular reasons, right? Just you walking down the street on the wrong day, the wrong time, you could be taken and be lynched in the South. Matter of fact, in the book it talks about how whites looked at blacks as like killing a flea or like killing a chicken or a snake. Like they were meaningless. They had no value at all after slavery. But when you look at the crucifixion of Christ, there is value in that. There is something to look at as to he died for the sins of the world at a particular time so that you can be forgiven. That's kind of the context of the crucifixion of Christ, is that what it symbolizes. It's not necessarily in the eyes of the Romans, it was a punishment. It was, who do you think you are? You think you're the king of the Jews? Let's get rid of you. You're out here doing miracles. They say you do this, they say you do that. Let's see if you really are the Messiah you say you are. And let's see if you can get off this cross, and let's see if you can do some kind of miracle while we watch you die. That was kind of the reason for the crucifixion, but it represented so much more than just a hate crime, if you will, as more sort of a lynching. You can kind of look at it that way. So I'm just kind of curious. I know he goes into into the book and discusses this, but I want to talk a little further for the audience as to why he can make the two comparisons when they're actually vastly different.
Well, I think the punishment is the same, right? As in the image of the person, the image of Christ, what was a political act. He was going against the state, right? And the image of freed Africans, freed enslaved Africans, also was going against the state of what United States were at that time for the South, right? It was going against what they thought was normal. So that's how you make the parallel there, right? But then at the same time, the parallel also goes into where they're the same was it was state terror, it was state sponsored. It was a spectacle, as in, people went out and got together and to celebrate these type of things. So whether it happened over 2,000 years ago or it happened for 200 years ago, now 100 years ago, the same type of situation. People went out to go see it and to celebrate it. He's making those type of those he make those basic ones, right? But he also saying in order Jesus identified with those suffering, the suffering of people, right? He identified so he always speaks upon the suffering of people and helping the suffering people. And so he also was saying he's saying that for Christians to understand, for Americans want to understand the plight of Christ, they could look at the suffering of African Americans and get a better understanding of that, right? So the similarities that if you want to understand what Christ went through, you could look at the suffering of what we go through. Same type of persecution that he went through is same similar to what we went through or what we're going through. So that's what we're saying. I don't think that he wished to make the contradiction. I mean, he want to make that contradiction that you're saying, like we are Jesus Christ. But he's saying that same way he was persecuted, we are persecuted also. Same way that the Rome was fearful of things that we're saying because we want to be free or we wanted more rights, whatever. The same thing he was saying to the people as I'm your king. If you follow me, you believe in me. There are other things. I mean, these things can come about versus following with Rome, the laws of Rome. So he was totally going against the grain in both forms. But I don't think that he's meaning to say that more or less like the black man's God. I don't think he's going that far.
He isn't going that far in suggesting that black people who were lynched possessed the same spiritual station as Jesus, but he is very clear, and in fact, in the conclusion of the text, he says that just as Christians can find salvation in understanding the suffering of Jesus and the true purpose of his crucifixion, so too does the lynching tree and understanding the experience of Black Americans in this country. So too can understanding that experience lead to salvation for everybody in America. And he says that the legacy of white supremacy in this country is something that has bound up Black and white people for better and for worse. And it must be through understanding that pain that we become true brothers and sisters in Christ. So I'll dig for it. I mean, given where the conversation has gone, but I mean, he literally does say, like, just as Jesus is to Christians, so must lynched Black men be for America, or something to that effect. I'll find it now. So, but I think that's why it's such an audacious claim, but also such a powerful one as well. I mean, he talks about how it is impossible, like the white church simply does not have the capacity to recognize the true spirit of Christianity because of its complicity in racism and upholding, promoting, protecting, advancing the cause of white supremacy in this country.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Yeah.
What do you think? What do you think, G, when you hear that?
Well, no, I mean, I'm not necessarily disputing it. I think you are onto something with that. I wanted to clarify, for those who might be thinking that it is a literal comparison between someone who is, we consider, those who are Christians, I should say, who consider to be, God, in a sense, yeah. I mean, you know what I'm saying? I mean, that's basically what he is. So, the Son of God, I should say. So, no, I mean, I think you're onto something with that. I'm not disputing it.
There was a comment in the chat somewhere.
About yeah. So the Tandra Lewis says, speak to chapter 4, bearing the cross. Martin Luther King Jr. struggled to redeem the soul of America, especially since we just celebrated his 55th death anniversary. I'm just trying. I just briefly was trying to look that chapter up because I'm actually not versed enough to really comment on this. I don't know if either one of you two can make a comment on this or not.
Well, keep in mind, so think about King. He was a minister. He was always aware of the suffering of Black people, right? Born in 1929. So it's hard. So I reading King. So reading that part in the chapter 4, he's talking about King. It's so hard to not. I try not to be too critical of King in his work. But he talks about and how there's a parallel also with suffering, whether it be King House being bombed, let me see. Look at my notes I wrote for this, and how so during he's talking about King and King love for people. So talking about King, even though during that time, right, he was talking about how King was. He could have. There were even some more militant individuals talking around that time, but King love of nonviolence and his ability to seek the gospel that way, seeing how God was so very compassionate towards people, even after the house being bombed. He felt that we cannot solve problems through being violent. Also, we must meet violence with nonviolence. But King also struggled with the meaning of the cross at various moments of his life. At various moments of his life too. He struggled with the meaning of the cross. But he wanted to. He made sure he wanted to follow Christ, even if it led to his death. And the funny thing is that there's a parallel between that is that his death was bigger. So his sacrifice, his life was one thing, but his death was more bigger than his life. So when he died, his perspective or how we view King was much bigger than when he was alive. Let's see. I mean, during that type chapter 2, he speaks. I mean, a lot of it he also speaks on other theologians, other white theologians during that time, and how in their not being inactive in fighting for civil rights. I kind of talked about a little bit about that earlier. So, you can speak about King, but also you can speak about the inactiveness of other theologians or white theologians during that time. So G, think about when I was reading it, I'm thinking of pulling it out of the context of theologians, But when I was reading, I'm thinking about the context of, we know these well-intentioned white liberals, right, who have a great understanding of right and wrong, right? And so they're living by a certain perspective of what right and wrong is, and they want to give as much as they can from their own heart because they believe in whatever racially. But it's up to a certain extent, right? It's up to a certain extent of they can't come to our schools though. I want schools to be equal. Black children have the right to have great education, but then it stops when they're going to my school now, or they're moving into my neighborhood. And for Cone, he realized that for a lot of white churches, is that some of the things happening. I mean, a lot of people spoke on racial issues, but there's a lot of talk, but not a lot of action, right? And then when if it really started to affect them personally or situations, they really became silent. And we see that a lot. We see that a lot in dealing with these well-meaning, well-intentioned white Christians. I mean, King spoke about that too. It was like when earlier in the struggle, the civil rights struggles, there were a lot of white people walking with him, or a lot of white people alongside him. But once again, they left him after a certain point. Where did they go? And so he speaks upon on those well-intentioned white people also.
Yeah. So she's referring to chapter. Yeah. Okay. So I just kind of did a little bit of a little cheat sheet on it. So I understand. So in chapter 4, he's talking about two theologians, that are basically who are cross bearers in a sense, like you were saying, both sacrifice. MLK, yeah, definitely he did sacrifice a lot, but the other person was Reynold Niebuhr.
Yeah, Niebuhr. Yep.
But these two particular theologians in the 20th century, who were, basically, in King's case, who was assassinated, but they both use the cross as an important theological symbol in their work and their lives. But only one of them, out of the two, was assassinated and died in a sense, died on the cross, that being King. So although he praises Reynolds' work, but you have to look at the two symbols of, well, one was essentially lynched, and one wasn't. So in terms of black and white. So yeah, that's an interesting concept, an interesting comparison, I should say.
But he also talks a lot of it. So a lot of it, the idea of black theology and the idea of the lynching tree is directly quote coming forward to white people, as in he says, my brothers and sisters, I want you to have a better understanding of Christ, and I want you to be free also, right? I want you to have that level of liberation, to be liberated also from whatever shackles there could be, but also the shackles of the past. And he had an issue with the church because they did not speak on. They could not see the parallels of the wrongs that were going on, and seeing what Jesus was speaking against. Right. So it was easy for them to. It was easy for the church to speak out on other atrocities that were going on in the world, but could not see the own atrocities that were going on, that were happening right around the corner. So that was one of the main things right there. He had an issue with the church, because why can't you see, if you're real Christians and you really tapping into the work of Christ, why can't you see other suffering, other people suffering?
I think another, so I know that in the text, Cone talks about Dr. King sort of taking up the cross as Jesus took up the cross, and he suggests that that recognizing the true spirit of Christ compels one to be inspired to relate to the downtrodden, to the poor, to the oppressed, and to take up that same struggle. And Cone talks about how he uses Malcolm X and Dr. King, in fact, and several others, as he closes the book out, to talk about the spiritual awakening that these great leaders had, and the role of the cross as sort of like a transcendent power. So it is not only a reminder of the true purpose of Christ, but also of the transcendent power that one's relationship to God, or for Christians to Christ, can have in the liberation struggle, and in one's commitment to liberation and fighting for the cause. That fighting for justice is not simply an act of revolution or of humanity. It is in accordance with God's teachings and God's expectations of us all. That in fact, there isn't anything revolutionary about fighting for the humanity of oneself or others. It's in fact what God has put us here to do, as indicated by Dr. King's quite deliberate, quite pronounced commitment to like taking up the cross as Christ did.
Well, so I think she might be referring to also so that redemptive suffering. So there's
Yeah.
always
Yes.
so he was always quote unquote suffering from something, always going through
Right.
something.
Right.
So King so some people may say like King has like a martyr complex, which caused him to be in like the middle of things, right? He was constantly being pulled into the center of things, even when he didn't want to be there. But King believed in redemptive suffering was part of the process of moving from oppression to liberation, right? But at the same time, he says, "I see the promised land." But I see it. So even though I'm being pulled into these things, even though I'm constantly at battle, even some of those could be internal battles, right? In going through all these type of things, I see the promised land. And so as the same thing as we were talking about with the Romans, they put the crown on the thorn, and it was saying, "Save yourself," right? I save yourself. If you're all that, you can save yourself. But at the same time, he realized he has to go through that process, right? He has to go through that process. In order for our sins to be washed away, he has to go through that process. So even though he could have, right? Even though he could have done something to free him from the situation, but he realized in order for us, he has to be crucified in this way. King also realized that in order for that level of freedom for us, in his viewpoint, I got to continue. That's how I seen it.
All right. So we should maybe explore a little bit further here and go into the next question for y'all.
I do got a question though. For some of you guys, let's think about so if we think about lynching and maybe some of these forms of punishment that was going on during that time. So keep in mind that this lynching was a form of control, fear. And some of those pictures that were there, just imagine seeing some of those things and the importance of what lynching was, or why people were lynching people, and the effects that they had on African Americans at the time. Are there any? Do you guys see any similarities of what with lynching nowadays, or within the last 3-4 years? Do you see any of those things like this? People? Of course, people are not being lynched, hung up on the tree. But what about things being done to control people, or things to put people back in their place, or things that white supremacy is running amok just for whatever reason that could be parallel to being lynched?
I think it's first important to recall something that Cone writes in the book, which is that one can lynch a person without a rope or tree.
Mm-hmm.
That's an exact quote. One can lynch a person without a rope or a tree. And so I think there are some obvious ones that we can draw out, such as the criminal justice system.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that an appropriate example could be what just happened to Angel Reese just a few days ago in the women's national championship game. When she taunted her white competitor, social media was ablaze from that moment on through the next day, and to a lesser extent even now as well, calling her classless, calling her a thug, calling her a hooligan, and everything in between, you know, that you can imagine. Whereas Caitlin Clark, who had taunted a competitor just the same way, just days earlier, was celebrated. And you know, we posted about that on our page, on our Facebook page. But I think that's a great example. But to your point, Angel Reese was not literally killed, was not literally lynched, but she was made to account for something that she shouldn't have been made to account for simply because of the color of her skin. And that's not unlike what happened to black men and even a few black women, you know, when lynchings were at their peak. So I think that's one that we could talk a little bit more about. I don't know what you guys think about that.
I think that's a good one. Can you think of anything, Grant? You don't have to be president recently, but maybe, you know, years ago.
I mean, I think I want to go a little further though, like you just talked about the criminal justice system, because I think that's something that, you know, we kind of glaze over, but looking at actually the data is astounding. Because, and before I get into that, because I think the modern day lynching is happening in the courtrooms across America. Because if you, in order to even get into the courtrooms, it's very similar to how black men and black women, and black men in particular, were even, you know, even got to the point of being lynched. And it was simple, silly, simple reasons, the same way that black men are being pulled into courtrooms for offenses that can carry, you know, mandatory sentences of 10 to 20 years, or sometimes, you know, these crazy sentences for petty crimes. But like a person could be lynched by simply just, you know, looking at a white person wrong. And Cone talks about that in his book. He talks about whites often lynch blacks simply to I'm sorry, let me point this out first. Cone says that whites often lynch blacks simply to remind the black community of their powerlessness. I thought that was huge, because that's still done today. The symbolism of lynching is a control mechanism. The same way the criminal justice system is done today. The police officers are doing the same thing today. A way to control the black community. And we get lynched in the courtroom by giving these long, lengthy sentences. And you look at the data when in terms of black Americans, in terms of the incarceration rates in state prisons in particular, were nearly 5 times the rate of white Americans. And nationally, 1 in 81 black adults in the U.S. is serving time in state prisons, in which the state of Wisconsin is really a place that we need to really be focusing on, because it leads the nation in black imprisonment rates. 1 in every 36 black from Wisconsin is in prison. And in 12 states, more than half the prison population is black. Alabama, Delaware, Georgia, Illinois, Louisiana, Maryland, Michigan, Mississippi, New Jersey, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. So there is a huge disparity between black and white. So the lynchings are still happening. The crucifixions, if you will, you know, in the sense of black people, are still happening. And they are in front of people. When you go into the courtroom, who's out there looking? Sometimes it's your family. Sometimes it's strangers. You don't know who all the people are in the court. Anybody can come to a court case. It's a public hearing. So they're still being lynched when the judge strikes the gavel and says 25 to life. That's a lynching. That's a person's life, depending on what age they are.
And
a life sentence.
I like that. I like that because keep in mind, with this, it's not saying anything against discipline, right? I think discipline is love, right? But it is something that can be said when if I get 2 years and I get 10, that's the problem.
And that happens. And that happens.
Yeah.
That happens.
Yeah. That's the problem where it's like he get 2 and there's 10.
Right.
And then realizing that what is taken away when we go to prison and when we're free, right? So like it's just recently that some people are getting access to vote, right? Or so keep on when you go to prison. So they sometimes in some ways you could be considered a slave. You can work for free. You can do all those things that were done to slaves could be equated to people in jail. So yeah.
And I think and that happens though too, Amari. That I mean, in this country, it isn't only that black men are and women are pulled over more often, disproportionately more often than their white counterparts. It's that black men and women are sentenced far more frequently than their white counterparts, and then are sentenced more harshly for the same crimes once found guilty on top of that. So it's inequality upon inequality upon inequality. So I agree. And when we talk about lynchings as prison sentences and compare lynchings to criminal justice, it's important to recognize that there are several members of the Black Panther Party who are still in prison today. One, Ed Poindexter, has been in prison for more than 50 years. The man is over 70 years old. He's almost 80 years old. He spent 50 years in prison. Now, bear in mind, Nelson Mandela, when he was freed, had spent, 27, 28 years in prison? He's considered one of the greatest leaders and advocates for human rights that the world has ever seen. And Ed Poindexter has spent almost twice the number of years in prison as Nelson Mandela. And he's not the only one. Kenny Zulu Whitmore has spent almost 50 years in prison. Veronza Bowers, almost 50 years in prison. Mumia Abu-Jamal has spent more than 40 years now in prison. And he just appealed to have a new trial, but the motion was thrown out. And this was just 2 days ago. His motion was based on the fact that the new district attorney in Philadelphia discovered evidence that had just been sitting in boxes, transcriptions of conversations between police detectives and an eyewitness who testified in Mumia's trial, in which this witness is asking the detective, when will I be paid for my testimony? It's there in black and white.
Yeah.
And the judge ruled that there was not enough evidence. The conversations among the prosecuting team about eliminating black jurors from the jury because they might be more sympathetic to Mumia's defense. These are documents, these are notes, handwritten notes by lawyers, transcripted conversations. And the judge in Philadelphia decided that there was not enough evidence to grant a retrial. Jamil El-Amin, formerly known as H. Rat Brown, he's been in prison since, I believe, 2003. He's 20 plus years. Kamal Siddiqui, also since about 2003. So Jojo Bowen, I mean, these are men who have fought for the freedom of Black and oppressed people in America and are sitting in jail right now and have been there for a combined, it's got to be 400 years at this point. So when we talk about lynchings that are happening today, these freedom fighters who are more the patriot than Samuel Adams, George Washington, John Hancock, and a whole lot of them. I mean, these are true freedom fighters, true revolutionaries, dying in jail cells as we speak.
Yeah.
We have a couple other comments. I don't know what you guys think about that, but there's another comment.
But he talks about the public educational system, even where we live, and how we're like in some African American communities, they're stacked up. We're stacked up against each other. We're living on in the density of a population is so great. And so it's some things. So that's almost like that's not the lynching, but at the same time, it creates a condition where life cannot thrive. So we've always talking about like the GI Bill and how when after vets came home, they had opportunity to go to school for a certain cost, or we're able to get homes with loans, right? FHA loans. Well, these same veterans were not able to get these loans, right? But at the same time, that they still have to live somewhere. And so even if they could get something to live with their family, they found themselves buying houses in the same poor communities that they were coming out of. If they got a home loan, they found themselves buying houses and then still needing to have renting out rooms to other people just to afford the high mortgage rate. But now the rate that Isaac, you probably somebody you and your family could have got was one rate versus different level rates. They were paying a lot more for houses than other people rate. So no matter what, you found African American vets not being able to increase their way of living because of the GA bill they couldn't get. So a lot of vets never applied for the loans or whatever. These like the FHA loans that many of us have when we got our house now, government backed. The government would tell contractors or whatever you cannot have a loan, or we're not offering a loan to Black people moving into these houses, these new houses, these new suburbs. So it's forcing African Americans to stay in these ghettos that they were living in. So now that even though they did something to get out of, even though they did something to increase their wealth or whatever, keep in mind they did something to better this country, they still couldn't move beyond where they were at. And so the density of coming back home now, the density living back in to these overpopulated situations, it never got better. So you find African Americans still living in these same cities, still living in these same areas, not able to get loans to buy houses or get loans to increase the value of their property to make it better. Families growing bigger, but still there's no way to put your to the new family members. So households that are single parent homes now, you got 2-3 generations living in one household now. So the density of a population is just getting bigger and bigger and worse. Then you got so many people living in one area, and sometimes that becomes unsafe, right? And so these things are happening. School system is at the same time, separate but equal, but not getting the same treatment. So it's you can see where there's a big disparity in how we were treated, or how Africans at that time, African Americans were treated, and what typical white people may be used to. But then I would say also in the book though, he talks. There's a quote that he talks about Baldwin. James Baldwin was talking. He made a few comments in the book that he quoted where he made one of the quotes where he said, I'm a paraphrase more or less. He was saying, not saying that all white people are bad, and I think this is something that I think we all hold true. We never say that all white people are bad or whatever, but that silence of white people is a problem. The silence of white people is a problem. And I think that's also where Combs has an issue with the church is the silence of the church. It's not that we're saying all the churches are bad, but when you know and you did nothing about it, when you knew about the lynchings and you professed nothing, or you say nothing about how bad it was, it's more or less you condemn the action. But within the same breath, you can sit back and say, "Well, there's something wrong going on across seas, right?" You could talk about another country, about the evil things that they're doing, but then you can't address the evils of your own country. So he talks about that silence um, is also is telling also about white people at that time. Also, he feels like I think he talks about how Baldwin states that black people find themselves that they can be called the best Christians and the best Americans because I think that in that I think some of it I do see that can be said as for the best Americans. I think because I can see Americans truly believe in those words that are written in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights. Um, in the Bill of Rights, we believe in those words. So I think that we find ourselves so um, upset when that level of justice just doesn't happen. So right now, I mean, as we look at what's going on with the former president, I think that hurts us more because we sit back and say, well, the book says this, but we see you guys justifying something totally different and not fighting up against other things.
Yeah, I think. Also, we have another comment here.
Eric makes another great comment. I mean, that sort of links the parallel that we were drawing about lynchings today. You're talking about the prison system and its similarities to the Roman Empire. And I think you mentioned it before, Amari. You said that there's nothing wrong with discipline, and there absolutely is not. But we also need to be clear that there's a difference between discipline and punishment, and between punishment and rehabilitation. And we, I think, must be honest with ourselves in this country and recognize that our prison system, our criminal justice system broadly, but in particular, our prison system is not designed to rehabilitate or even to discipline. It is to punish, and in particular, to punish black bodies and brown bodies. Um, so I appreciate Eric for that comment. And then yeah, Nikita says silence is condoning. Yeah, I mean it's just like the difference between being not racist and anti-racist. And it's not enough, especially for my people and I, to just be not racist, because that is to accept the status quo and to do nothing about it, to not act against it. Yeah. So I appreciate Nikita's point there too about silence.
Well, this was an interesting conversation we had this evening. I think it definitely made you think tonight. I think the comments reflect that. I think people really enjoyed the conversation. I think we got some understanding. But as always, with these conversations, we would like you to share this information. Of course, this recording will be on our Facebook page. So if you want to share this recording tonight, that's going to be available. Maybe you're going to go to a little deeper dive and discussions. And I challenge you all to read the book. It's one of his many great works of writings that he was able to produce before his passing, and it definitely can spark a lot of different conversations. We don't have time tonight to go even further. We could, but of course we don't have that kind of time. So before we close out, if you want to put any last comments or any last comments from one of you as before we close out tonight.
You got anything to say, Ike?
No, I'm looking forward to talking about our next conversation, our next meetup.
What's that about?
Well, I think it's better just to show everybody rather than tell.
Let me see. Have I seen it? I don't think I have. Let me see what you got to show.
Oh, I think you've seen this a couple times, but let's give it another watch.
Okay, let's go ahead.
Have you ever said, "All lives matter," in response to Black Lives Matter? Do you deny your privilege while claiming to be victimized and abused? Do you celebrate the Confederacy but denigrate Black History Month? If you answered yes to any or all of these questions, you might be a douchebag. But there's hope. 360collective.online is finding new ways to address this unfortunate phenomenon.
How to spot a douchebag and what to do next. Live, Wednesday, April 19th at 8 p.m. 360collective.online. Real power is people.
Wow, yeah, well, if that didn't do anything to you, I don't know what to say. Well, it's made to be satire in somewhat of a sense, but it's a real question, and it's a real conversation we're gonna have. April 19th, all right, Wednesday, 8:00 Eastern Standard Time. Come back here. We definitely want to see you. We want to talk with you about this important topic. Really, I mean, we need to discuss this. So we hope you enjoy that advertisement. We get a kick out every time we see it, no matter how many times you looked at it. It's something to kind of make you just think. I mean, in a sense, it is sort of funny when you look at it of just how it's laid out. But the topic is definitely something warranted for a discussion. And we hope to see you back here April 19th. And yeah, looking forward to that. Other things, we always want to talk about our consulting work that we do as well. This is a sort of a brief summary of other things that we offer in terms of our core curriculum. We are definitely available to discuss these particular focus areas. If you're interested, please contact us and go to our website and check us out at 360collective.online or give us a call, 360-553-1636, or drop us an email, info@360collective.online. I know it's kind of flashing here pretty quick, but you can go to our website. You can go a little more in depth and look at it for yourself. And if you're interested, by all means, we're happy to come to you, whether it's by in person or a virtual space, wherever's convenient for you, we're willing to do so for a nominal fee. In some cases, we may not, depending on what it is, may not even charge you. But so again, we are glad that you all joined us tonight. And as we always say every day, not every day, but every week, we're on Real Powers People.
All right, Real Power People, y'all.